She was born with a mark on her spine that no prayer could remove. 3 elders had examined it by torchlight, each one stepping back in silence. The first time in the temple's 4th-century history that a newborn's naming ceremony was suspended mid-ritual. The midwife whispered that the child felt cold to the touch, as if the warmth of mortal blood had been exchanged for something thinner, something borrowed. Her mother, a woman named Tamar, who had prayed at the incense altar every morning for 7 years, knew the mark was not a birth defect. It was a signature, and signatures in the language of heaven are never placed without consent. But Tamar had never given consent for this. Here is what the scrolls of the Second Temple period record about such marks. In the year 739, before the Common Era, a priest named Azrael documented a case of an infant bearing a hexagonal impression on the lower back, which he linked to an angelic visitation during the mother's pregnancy. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, contains a fragment known as the Gospel of Judas that refers to such signs as seals of the upper house, impressions left on the soul when a heavenly being has touched a mortal lineage. The text does not describe these as blessings. It describes them as transaction records, spiritual ledgers that prove something was exchanged between the celestial and the earthly. Tamar's daughter carried a seal of transaction. The question was, what had been traded and who was waiting to collect? The child's name was Elisheba, which means, God is my oath. By the time she was 12 years old, 2 things had become undeniable. The first was that she could see beings that others could not. Not ghosts in the folk sense, but tall, 6-winged forms that flickered at the edges of her vision whenever the temple incense burned during the evening sacrifice. The second was that every person who touched her for more than a few heartbeats would later complain of a burning cold that lingered in their palms, as though they had held a stone from the moon. Her mother took her to the elders again. This time, they did not step back in silence. They brought out the Book of Enoch, specifically the section that describes the Watchers and their offspring, and asked the girl a question that would define the rest of her life. Elisheba, daughter of Tamar, daughter of the covenant, the chief elder said, his voice trembling despite his authority. Have you ever seen a being of burning light weep? She answered without hesitation. Yes, every night since I was 4 years old. The elder closed the scroll. He sent everyone out of the chamber and sat alone for a long time. When he emerged, he told Tamar that her daughter must never enter the holy place, and that if she did, the seal on her spine would ignite and consume her from within. But he refused to explain why. This is the part most people miss when they read the old texts. The elders of the Second Temple period did not lack knowledge about Seraphim. They possessed enough knowledge to be terrified. The Mishnah, codified around 200 years after the Common Era, contains a ruling that a child bearing an angelic signature may not participate in any temple ritual involving fire, because fire answers to beings higher than priests. The elders knew they were not dealing with a possession. They were dealing with a co-signing of the bloodline, and they had no legal right to annul a divine contract. Tamar was not satisfied with silence. She began a secret search through the temple archives, pulling scrolls that had not been unrolled since the reign of King Hezekiah. In one of them, a commentary on the vision of Isaiah, she found a description of an event that matched her daughter's condition exactly. The text described a seraph that had descended to earth not to deliver a message, but to enter into a bond with a human woman. A bond sealed by the seraph's own wings. The commentator, a man named Elisheba, who served under the prophet Jeremiah, wrote that such a bond could not be broken by mortal means. It could only be fulfilled, and the fulfillment required the return of the original offering. In other words, if a seraph had given something of itself to Elisheba's bloodline, that something would have to be given back, and the interest on that debt grew with every passing year. Now you must understand the nature of what we are discussing. The Seraphim, as described in Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, are 6-winged beings who stand in the direct presence of God. They do not rebel. They do not fall. The Book of Enoch and the Nag Hammadi texts are consistent on this point. Seraphim are not adversarial entities. They are worshiping beings, attendants of the divine throne, and their primary function is purification through fire. A seraph touching a human is not a demonic act.
It is an intrusion from the highest order of creation into mortal space, and that intrusion carries a weight that the human frame was never designed to bear. Think about that. A seal that cannot be broken, only fulfilled. A debt that compounds with every generation. If you want to follow the unraveling of this heavenly bond, subscribe so you do not miss what Elisheba discovers next. And in the comments, write the word debt, because before this story is over, you will see exactly how high the interest can climb. If you have ever felt that certain relationships leave a mark that does not fade, even when the person is gone, you know something of what Elisheba carried. The seal on her spine was not a curse in the moral sense. It was a presence, a signature of attention from a being that existed in the perpetual fire of God's presence. And attention from that realm, once given, does not simply end when the seraph withdraws its wings. It remains like heat remains in a stone after the sun has set. The International Journal of Pastoral Theology published a study in 2021 examining believers who reported persistent sensory experiences after intense spiritual encounters. And the researchers found that measurable physiological changes, temperature shifts, electromagnetic anomalies, altered pain thresholds, could persist for years after the initial event. Tamar did not have that study. She had her daughter's cold skin and the sight of beings flickering at the edge of the incense smoke. She also had a husband who had fled when Elisheba was 3 years old, unable to bear the weight of a child who whispered conversations with someone he could not see. Tamar raised the girl alone, in a small house on the eastern edge of Jerusalem, where the morning light struck the temple gold and cast a shadow that fell exactly across their doorstep at the 9th hour every day. Elisheba grew tall and quiet, with eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. She made friends reluctantly, because every friendship ended the same way. The other child would complain of cold hands and strange dreams, and the parents would forbid further contact. By the time she was 16, Elisheba had learned to avoid touching anyone. She wrapped her hands in linen during the market visits. She slept with her back turned to the wall. She stopped asking her mother about the 6-winged figure that wept in her dreams. But the weeping did not stop. If anything, it grew louder as she approached womanhood. And here is what changes everything. In the 3rd month of her 17th year, during the Feast of Weeks, when the temple was filled with the first wheat offerings and the air was thick with the smoke of burnt grain, Elisheba felt something she had never felt before. A pull from within the temple itself, as if a hand had reached through her ribs and hooked a finger behind her heart. She tried to resist. She knelt in the courtyard and pressed her palms to the stone floor. But the pull did not release. It grew stronger, and with it came a voice that she had heard every night of her life, but never during the day. The voice said, "You are the seal I left behind." Elisheba rose to her feet. She walked toward the holy place. The priests shouted at her to stop. The elders, recognizing the mark on her spine, now glowing through her tunic, threw themselves in her path. But she did not stop, because the voice was not commanding her. It was revealing her. And revelation, once received, cannot be unreceived. What she saw when she entered the chamber is not recorded in any surviving temple document, but the Gospel of Judas, in the fragments that remain, describes an encounter in which a human being crosses a spiritual boundary and comes face to face with a being who has been bound to them since birth. The text says the being will weep, and the human will ask why, and the being will answer, "Because I gave up my station when I gave you my name, and now I cannot return until you release me." Elisheba, standing in the holy place as the incense burned low and the veil shifted in a draft. No one else could feel, understood in that moment that she was not haunted. She was held. The seraph stood between the altar and the curtain, its wings folded tight to its body, not in the great spread that Isaiah described, but compressed, diminished, as though it had shrunk itself to fit inside the space that a human lifetime occupies. Its face was like fire contained within glass, bright but not consuming, and it was weeping, not tears of sorrow exactly, tears of a presence that had been compressed into a form that could exist in a world where fire burns and stone stands still. "I chose you," the seraph said, "not as a vessel, not as a servant.
I chose you because I saw your name written before the foundation of the earth, and I knew that if I did not mark you, no one would remember what I was." Elisheba understood. The Seraph had not fallen like the Watchers. It had not broken covenant like the rebellious angels who took human wives in the days of Noah. It had done something far more dangerous. It had given its identity to a bloodline, and in doing so, it had tied its own eternal existence to a finite human lineage. The Seraph could not ascend again to the throne until the purpose of that bond was fulfilled. And the purpose, the Seraph now told her, was not protection or blessing. "You will bear a child," the Seraph said, "and that child will not be mine. It will be yours, fully human, but the seal on your spine will pass to it. And when it does, my wings will return to me. I will ascend, and you will never see me again." Elisheba stood in the incense haze, the gold of the altar, reflecting light across her face. And she asked the question that no human had ever asked a Seraph before. "Will you forget me when you ascend?" The Seraph's answer was not what she expected. It said, "I cannot forget you. I will carry the memory of your name in the fire of my voice for eternity. That is the cost. That is the sacrifice. When my wings return, your seal will break, but the memory of you will remain inside me as a burn that never heals, because heaven does not heal from love. It only praises through it." That line, "heaven does not heal from love," is the kind of truth that rewires how you understand sacrifice. If moments like this stir something in you, subscribe so we can continue uncovering the hidden costs written into every covenant. Drop the word memory in the comments if Tamar, crouched at the threshold of the holy place, heard the last part of this conversation. She saw the Seraph's 6 wings begin to unfold, slowly, like cloth that had been folded for centuries, and was now remembering its original shape. She saw her daughter's hand reach out and touch the Seraph's face, and she saw the Seraph turn its burning gaze toward her, toward Tamar, the mother who had raised a child, marked by a being from the throne room of God, and speak words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "You prayed at the incense altar every morning for 7 years, the Seraph said. "You asked for your daughter to be surrounded by angels. You did not specify what kind. Your prayer was heard. Your prayer was granted, and now the cost of your prayer must be paid." Tamar did not weep. She only said, "I would still pray the same prayer, even knowing what I know now." The Seraph looked at her for a long moment. Then it said, "That is why I chose your bloodline." The wings spread fully. The veil did not tear. It simply dissolved, as though time itself had skipped a beat in that space. Elisheba felt her spine burn, not with pain, but with a sensation that can only be described as extraction. As if something that had been sewn into her marrow was now being pulled out through the bone, thread by thread, by a hand that knew exactly where each thread was anchored. She fell to her knees. The incense smoke swirled around her, and the Seraph began to rise, not upward through the ceiling, but sideways into a space that did not exist until it stepped into it. Before it disappeared completely, the Seraph turned its face one last time toward Elisheba and said 7 words that she would repeat to herself every night for the rest of her life. "I will burn your name until heaven ends." Then it was gone. The curtain fell back into place. The incense smoke settled, and Elisheba, daughter of Tamar, daughter of the covenant, was left alone on the stone floor of the holy place, her back cold, her hands warm, and her womb already beginning to change. She did not know it yet, but the seal had not fully transferred. Part of it, the deepest part, the part that had grown into her being like roots into bedrock, remained with her. The Seraph had intended to take all of it. But something had gone wrong. Or perhaps something had gone exactly as it was meant to. Do you see what happened? The Seraph had given its name to the bloodline, but names in the language of heaven cannot be returned the same way they are given. Once a being of the throne grafts its identity into a mortal lineage, the lineage holds a fragment of that being forever, not as a possession, but as a witness. The Seraph thought it could withdraw its wings and sever the bond completely. It was mistaken. The bond had become two-way. The seal was not a collar. It was a mirror. Elisheba rose from the floor and walked out of the holy place without looking back. Her mother was waiting in the outer court, her face wet with tears she had not shed during the conversation, but was now releasing in full. They embraced, and for the first time in years, Tamar did not feel cold when she touched her daughter. She felt heat. The same heat that had been missing from the girl's skin since birth was now returning, slowly, like blood flowing back into a limb that had been pressed against stone for too long. But the heat brought something else with it. A voice. Not the Seraph's voice, deep and resonant and layered with fire. A different voice, smaller, closer, coming from inside the body itself, as if someone was speaking from a room on the other side of a very thin wall. The voice said only one word, and it did not repeat itself. Azrael. Elisheba did not know what the word meant, but she knew that it was not a human name, and she knew that she had not been the one to speak it. This is where the story becomes heavier than most are willing to carry. Because Elisheba did not return to her normal life after that day. She returned to a life that was no longer hers. The seal had been partially extracted, but what remained was not a residue of the past. It was a preparation for the future. She began to see, not just Seraphim, but other beings, lower beings, beings that had been waiting for the Seraph to leave so they could approach. And they were not weeping, they were smiling. The first one appeared 3 nights after the Feast of Weeks. It stood at the foot of her bed, its form indistinct. Its presence felt more as a drop in temperature than as a visible shape. It spoke in a language that sounded like grinding stones, and Elisheba understood every word. "The Seraph is gone," it said. "His mark is fading, but you still carry the echo of his name, and echoes can be collected." Her mother heard her screaming and ran in with a lamp. The shape vanished, but the cold remained in the room for another hour, and the lamp burned dimmer than it should have, as if the flame itself was afraid. Tamar sat beside her daughter and did not sleep that night. She held the girl who had been marked by a 6-winged being of fire, and she prayed, not to God, but to the Seraph, whose name she had never known. "You left her," she whispered into the dark. "You gave her a piece of yourself, and then you took most of it back. And now the hole you left is filling with things you should have protected her from." There was no answer, but in the morning, when Tamar checked her daughter's back, the mark had changed shape. It was no longer a hexagonal impression. It had become a shape that looked like a set of scales, the kind of scales that measure a soul against a feather. And Elisheba, looking at the mark in a polished bronze mirror, said the second thing she was not supposed to know. "He didn't leave. He was taken, and he's waiting for me to come and find him." This is the part where the contract reveals its true nature. The Seraph had not voluntarily chosen to bond with Elisheba's bloodline. It had been sent. Maimonides, in his Mishneh Torah, codified the laws of angelic interaction with the physical world, and he wrote that a Seraph cannot leave the presence of God of its own accord. It must be commissioned. If a Seraph descended to earth and bonded with a mortal, it was not a romance. It was an assignment. The assignment had been fulfilled. The seal had been placed. The child was conceived in spirit, if not yet in body. And now the Seraph had returned to the throne, not to resume its place, but to report. The question, the one that burns beneath every detail of this account, is this. Why would God send a Seraph to mark a human bloodline? What was being prepared? What was being built across generations that required the signature of a being whose natural voice is a perpetual declaration of holiness? The answer lies in the name the voice inside Elisheba had spoken. Azrael. In Hebrew, the name means helper of God, or whom God helps, but in a different source text, one that is not canonical but nonetheless preserved in the mystical traditions of the 16th century. Azrael is described as the angel of separation, the one who oversees the division of soul from body, and in some accounts, soul from soul. Elisheba had spoken the name of a being whose function was to separate what had been joined. And if a Seraph had joined itself to her bloodline, and a being of separation had now been summoned into that same line. The implication was clear. The bond was never meant to last. The Seraph was a bridge. Azrael was the demolition. But demolition in the spiritual realm is never destruction. It is reconfiguration. And reconfiguration requires a third party, a soul that can hold the tension between the joining and the separation long enough for something new to be born. Elisheba was not just the vessel. She was the fulcrum. And the weight she was designed to bear was not the weight of the Seraph's presence. It was the weight of its absence. By the time her 20th year arrived, Elisheba had learned to live with the weight of an absence that pressed harder than any presence ever had. She had not conceived a child, despite what the Seraph had foretold. Her body remained unchanged, her womb silent, as though the seal that had been partially extracted had taken with it the capacity to carry new life. The mark on her spine had settled into a permanent ache, not painful, but constant, like the memory of a limb that had been removed. She could still feel the Seraph's voice sometimes,
I hear you.
not as words, but as a pressure behind her sternum, a warmth that rose and fell with her breath. But the warmth was fading, and as it faded, the cold returned. The cold that returned to Elisheba's bones is the same cold that settles over every soul when a covenant begins to dissolve. A weight so familiar you forget what presence ever felt like. If this story has pressed against a hidden place in your own chest, subscribe so you don't lose the thread of what happens to a woman tasked with holding absence as her only inheritance. And in the comments, share this. What word would you use to describe the moment you realized a bond you carried was fading? Absence or release? She began to visit the temple every morning, not to pray, but to stand in the outer court and watch the smoke rise from the altar. Other women her age were being betrothed, married, bearing children who would inherit the covenant. Elisheba stood apart, wrapped in linen that covered her hands and neck, her eyes fixed on a point that no one else could see. The elders did not approach her. They had heard what happened in the holy place during the Feast of Weeks, and they had decided in a quiet council that left no written record that Elisheba was to be left alone. She was not cursed, they agreed, but she was no longer entirely human. She was a boundary, a place where heaven and earth had touched and failed to separate cleanly, and boundaries in the spiritual economy of the temple were to be observed from a distance, 6 months after the Seraph's departure, on the first day of the month of Tishrei, the day of Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets. Elisheba felt something shift inside her, not in her womb, in her chest. The warmth that had been fading suddenly flared, not with the Seraph's voice, but with the grinding stone language of the being that had appeared at her bedside. The being was present again, this time in broad daylight, standing in the midst of the festival crowd, and no one else saw it. It was a tall figure, human-shaped but wrong in its proportions, as though it had been stretched and compressed at the same time. Its face was smooth, featureless except for a mouth that opened sideways rather than vertically, and it spoke without moving its jaw. "The echo is nearly spent," it said. "When it dies, you will be ours." Elisheba did not run. She had not run from the Seraph, and she would not run from this. She turned to face the figure fully, and in that moment, the mark on her spine began to burn. Not with the searing heat of the Seraph's presence, but with a cold fire that spread through her ribs and into her throat. She opened her mouth, and a sound came out that was not her voice. It was the Seraph's voice, the deep, resonant voice that had spoken to her in the holy place. But it was fractured, broken, as though it was being broadcast through a damaged instrument. "You have no claim here," the voice said. "The seal is not yours to take."
Your world
The figure
is a fragile
tilted its
deception.
head. "The seal is no longer yours to keep. You gave it to her, but you did not fully withdraw it. Now it decays, and what decays belongs to the lower places. You know the law." The Seraph's voice did not answer. It could not answer, because it was not present. It was only the echo, the remnant, the fragment of identity that had been grafted into blood and had not been fully detached. And echoes have no will of their own. They only repeat what they last heard. Elisheba understood this in a way that bypassed thought. She understood that the Seraph was not coming back. It could not come back. The bridge it had built was designed to be crossed only once, and it had crossed it, leaving the bridge intact but unguarded. She was the bridge now. The weight she bore was not absence, it was maintenance. She was the one who kept the bond from decaying into the hands of the lower beings who circled her, like wolves around a dying fire. And she had no idea how to do it. The festival crowd continued to move around her, unaware. The trumpets sounded from the temple. The smoke of burnt offerings rose in a thick column against the pale blue sky. And Elisheba, daughter of Tamar, daughter of the covenant, stood alone in the center of the crowd and felt the echo of a seraph's name burning inside her, like a coal that would not go out. She did not pray. She did not weep. She did not cry out to a heaven that had already made its transaction. She simply stood, her hands wrapped in linen, her spine aching with the mark of a being that had loved her enough to give up its wings and was now unreachable. And she spoke, not aloud, but in the silent chamber of her own soul, a single sentence that would become the foundation of everything she would become. I will carry you until I find you.
Until I find
The figure
you.
with the sideways mouth vanished. The cold retreated. The ache in her spine settled into a steady pulse, like a heartbeat that had found its rhythm after years of arrhythmia. And Elisheba walked home through the streets of Jerusalem, her shadow stretching long before her, her steps measured and sure, a woman who had been marked by fire and was now learning to burn on her own. The seal had not fully transferred. The Seraph had not fully ascended. The bond was not complete. But it was not broken either. It was waiting. And waiting, as the elders of the temple knew but would never admit, is a form of presence. The incense burned low. The altar stood cold. The woman who had touched a six-winged being of fire and lived to remember it walked into her house, sat down at the table where her mother had laid out bread and oil, and began to eat as though she had just returned from a long journey. And in the space between her spine and her soul, a name continued to burn, not as a wound, but as a vow. She would find him,